Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
"I have no money," Father cried. "Hell's Angel saw me in the corner. She'll serve as payment." Daniel Miller sat at his kitchen table, the wood beneath his elbows worn smooth from years of use. Empty coffee cups and scattered bills covered most of the surface. His weathered hands clutched his phone, its screen lighting up with yet another missed call notification. The name Thompson Custom Homes flashed across the display, joining a dozen other ignored messages from clients he'd never be able to repay. The morning light filtered through dusty windows, casting shadows across the cluttered room. Half-finished furniture pieces lined the walls, remnants of orders he couldn't complete. A beautiful cherry wood dresser stood in the corner, its drawers still missing their handles. The sight of it made his stomach twist with shame. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He rubbed his tired eyes, feeling every one of his 50-plus years. The house felt emptier than usual this morning, with Lila away at her morning shift at the diner. The thought of his daughter made his chest tighten. She'd been picking up extra shifts lately, trying to help with the bills, though he'd never asked her to. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry." The distinct rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through his thoughts. The sound grew louder, echoing off the houses in their quiet neighborhood. Daniel's hands began to shake as he set his phone down. He knew this moment was coming, had been dreading it for weeks, but nothing could have prepared him for the cold fear that now gripped his heart. The motorcycle's engine cut off. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel driveway. Daniel stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. His legs felt weak as he moved to the kitchen window. Through the dirty glass, he could see the massive black motorcycle parked in his driveway, its chrome gleaming in the morning sun. It looked so out of place in this modest neighborhood, like a shark in a pond full of minnows. His fingers traced the edge of the envelope in his pocket, the one containing every last dollar he'd managed to scrape together. It wasn't enough. Not even close. The sound of heavy footsteps approached his front door. Daniel's throat went dry as he remembered the day he'd made the deal. He'd been desperate, the bank breathing down his neck, suppliers threatening to cut him off. The Hell's Angels had seemed like his last resort, his only way to keep his business afloat and provide for Lila. What a fool he'd been. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime jarringly out of place. Daniel's feet felt like they were made of lead as he walked to the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, and he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. He opened the door slowly, revealing the imposing figure of Big Vince. The man seemed to fill the entire doorframe, his thick beard and dark eyes making him look like something out of Daniel's worst nightmares. Tattoos snaked up his neck and disappeared beneath his leather jacket, telling stories Daniel didn't want to know. Without waiting for an invitation, Vince stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved into the entryway. His presence seemed to make the room smaller, darker somehow. "Time to pay up, Miller," Vince said, his voice low and gravelly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken threats. Daniel stood frozen, feeling the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a physical force. In that moment, he realized that his mistakes had finally caught up with him, and the price might be more than he could bear to pay. The morning sun cast long shadows through the living room windows as Vince towered over Daniel. His leather vest creaked as he crossed his arms, the patches of his Hell's Angels membership clearly visible. The room felt smaller with him in it, the walls closing in around them. "I've got some money," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. His trembling hands pulled out the envelope from his pocket. It's not all of it, but not all of it? Vince's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the words. He didn't even glance at the envelope. That wasn't our agreement, Miller. Daniel's shoulders slumped. Dust particles danced in the sunbeam between them, the only movement in the tense silence. The half-finished furniture scattered around the room seemed to mock him now, remnants of a craft he'd once been proud of, before everything fell apart. Please, Daniel said, his voice cracking. I just need more time. The business will pick up, I swear. I've got some new orders coming in. You've had 6 months. Vince's eyes narrowed, his massive frame blocking out the light from the window. 6 months of extensions, promises, and excuses. You know how this works. The words hung heavy in the air. Of course Daniel knew. Everyone knew what happened when you couldn't pay your debts to the Hells Angels. His hands began to shake harder, and the envelope slipped from his fingers, scattering bills across the worn carpet. The sound of a key in the front door made both men turn. Daniel's heart stopped as Lila stepped inside, still wearing her diner uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She froze when she saw Vince, her green eyes widening with fear. Dad? Her voice was small, uncertain. She took a hesitant step backward. Lila, honey, go to your room, Daniel pleaded, but his voice had lost all authority. He watched helplessly as she stood rooted to the spot, like a deer caught in headlights. Vince's gaze shifted to Lila, and something changed in his expression. His eyes traveled over her face, calculating, measuring. The silence stretched out, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I can't pay, Daniel finally admitted, his voice trembling. He could barely force the words out, knowing what they meant, knowing what would happen next. I can't. Vince's attention returned to Daniel, his face unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was eerily calm, almost gentle. She'll serve as payment. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He swayed on his feet, gripping the back of a nearby chair for support. This was his fault. All of it. Every poor decision, every desperate gamble had led to this moment. In the corner, Lila stood frozen, her face pale with shock. The morning sunlight streaming through the window caught the tears beginning to form in her eyes. Vince raised his arm, pointing one tattooed finger directly at her, marking her as collateral for her father's debt. The old clock continued its relentless ticking, counting down the moments of Lila's freedom, while outside, the peaceful suburban morning carried on, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding within these walls. The silence in the room was deafening. Lila's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, each beat matching the tick of the old clock on the wall. Her father's eyes, red-rimmed and glistening, met hers across the room. The shame written across his weathered face made her stomach twist. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, the words barely audible. His shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight. "I'm so sorry, baby girl." Lila's mind spun like a carousel gone wrong. This couldn't be real. Just this morning, she'd served coffee and pancakes at the diner, smiling at regular customers, planning to help her dad in the workshop later. Now her whole world was crumbling around her. She looked at Vince, trying to make sense of his presence. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire doorway, blocking any escape. The patches on his leather vest caught her eye, skulls and wings, marking him as someone dangerous, someone to fear. But there was something else in his eyes when he looked at her, something that didn't match his intimidating appearance. "Dad," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "What did you do?" Daniel's face crumpled. He sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. After your mother died, I couldn't keep up with the bills. The business was failing. I needed money fast, and the bank wouldn't help. His voice broke. I thought I could pay it back. Lila wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly cold despite the warm morning sun streaming through the windows. The half-finished furniture around them, her father's pride and joy, now seemed like sad reminders of better days. "How much?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. 50,000, Vince answered before Daniel could speak. His deep voice rumbled through the room. "Plus interest." The number hit Lila like a physical blow. She looked around their modest home, at the worn carpet and faded curtains. They'd never have that kind of money. Not now, maybe not ever. "And you want me?" The words felt strange in her mouth. Vince nodded slowly. "You'll work off his debt." "At our club." Images flashed through Lila's mind, all the terrible possibilities of what that might mean. Her hands started to tremble, and she pressed them against her sides to still them. But as she looked at her father, slumped in his chair, defeated and broken, something shifted inside her. This was the man who had raised her alone after her mother died, who had worked countless late nights in his workshop to keep food on their table, who had always tried his best, even when his best wasn't good enough. She thought of all the times he'd protected her, comforted her, supported her dreams. Now it was her turn to protect him. Lila drew in a shaky breath and lifted her chin. Her hand trembled as she nodded, the movement slight but decisive. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll go." "Lila, no!" Daniel stumbled to his feet, reaching for her. "You don't have to do this. We'll find another way." But Vince was already moving towards the door, his cold smile acknowledging her agreement. He held it open, waiting for her to follow. The morning sunlight spilled across the threshold, marking a line between her old life and whatever waited ahead. With one last look at her father, Lila stepped forward. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward the door, toward Vince, toward an uncertain future that terrified her. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, as Vince's large hand settled on her shoulder, guiding her out into the morning light. The motorcycle engine rumbled to life beneath them, its deep vibrations traveling through Lila's entire body. She perched awkwardly behind Vince, her hands hovering uncertainly near his leather vest. The night air was cool against her skin, and she wished she'd had time to grab a jacket before leaving. "Hold on," Vince's gruff voice commanded over the engine's growl. "Unless you want to fall off." Reluctantly, Lila gripped the sides of his vest. The leather was worn smooth in places, telling stories she wasn't sure she wanted to know. As they pulled away from the curb, the force pushed her backward, and she instinctively tightened her hold. Streetlights flickered past them like shooting stars, casting alternating shadows and light across the pavement. The city looked different at night, transformed into something unfamiliar and slightly threatening. Signs from closed shops glowed dimly, and the few people still out at this hour hurried along with their heads down. The wind whipped Lila's hair around her face, and she squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Her father's broken expression kept flashing through her mind, along with fragments of memories. Breakfast together just that morning, working side by side in his workshop last weekend, the proud smile he'd worn at her high school graduation. How had everything gone so wrong? They stopped at a red light, and Lila opened her eyes to see they were heading toward the industrial district. The buildings here were bigger, darker, with fewer windows and more chain-link fences. Her heart picked up speed as they passed the last familiar landmarks and ventured into territory she'd never explored. The motorcycle's headlight cut through the darkness, illuminating empty loading docks and abandoned warehouses. Lila's fingers had gone numb from their tight grip on Vince's vest, but she couldn't bring herself to loosen them. He was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. The air grew cooler as they left the city proper behind, the buildings thinning out until they were traveling through areas of wasteland dotted with the occasional structure. Lila's throat felt tight, and she fought to keep her breathing steady. Each inhale brought the scent of leather, motor oil, and something distinctly masculine that must be Vince's cologne or soap. The motorcycle slowed as they approached a massive gate set into a high wall. Security lights cast harsh shadows across the compound beyond, making it impossible to see clearly what lay inside. As they drew closer, Lila could make out the shapes of other motorcycles parked in neat rows, and several dark buildings looming against the night sky. Vince pressed a button on a small remote attached to his handlebars, and the gate began to slide open with a metallic groan. The sound made Lila shiver, reminding her of prison doors in movies. As they passed through the entrance, she noticed cameras mounted at regular intervals along the wall, their red lights blinking steadily in the darkness. The motorcycle's engine echoed off the surrounding buildings as they wound their way through the compound. Other bikes were scattered around, some under tarps, others gleaming in the security lights. A few windows showed light behind drawn curtains, but most of the buildings were dark and silent. Finally, Vince brought the motorcycle to a stop in front of one of the larger structures. The engine's rumble died away, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the soft whisper of wind. Lila felt a deep chill settle into her bones as she took in her surroundings, the high walls, the cameras, the shadowy buildings. This wasn't just a place, it was a fortress, and it was now her new reality. Lila's legs felt shaky as she dismounted from the motorcycle, her feet touching the gravel with a soft crunch. The compound sprawled before her like an alien landscape, nothing like the quiet suburban streets she called home. Chain-link fences topped with razor wire stretched into the darkness, and the air carried the mingled scents of cigarette smoke, motor oil, and leather. A group of bikers lounged near one of the buildings, their leather vests displaying patches and insignias she didn't understand. The dim security lights caught the glint of silver rings on their fingers and chrome on their bikes. A woman with long, dark hair and sleeve tattoos looked Lila up and down, then whispered something to the man beside her. Lila crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked in her simple t-shirt and jeans. These people wore their tough lives like armor, boots scuffed from the road, faces weathered by sun and wind, eyes that had seen too much. A few of them nodded at Vince as he secured his bike, but their gazes lingered on Lila with unmistakable curiosity. "This way," Vince said, his voice low but firm. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steering her toward one of the smaller buildings. The touch wasn't rough, but it left no room for argument. More bikers were gathered around a makeshift outdoor seating area, some playing cards while others talked in hushed tones. The glow of cigarettes punctuated the darkness like fireflies. A burst of laughter echoed across the compound, making Lila jump slightly. It sounded harsh against the quiet night. Music drifted from somewhere nearby. Classic rock turned down low, the kind her father used to play in his workshop. The familiar sound only heightened how foreign everything else felt. Gravel crunched under their feet as they walked, and Lila noticed oil stains on the ground, dark patches that looked almost like shadows in the dim light. As they approached the building, Lila could see it was some sort of clubhouse. A neon beer sign buzzed in one window, casting a red glow onto the weathered siding. The door opened, spilling yellow light onto the gravel, and two men stepped out. They were both tall and broad-shouldered, their vests covered in patches. One of them caught sight of Vince and raised his chin in acknowledgement. The men stepped aside as Vince guided Lila towards the entrance. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale beer. A few overhead lights cast a dim glow over mismatched furniture, worn leather couches, wooden chairs, and tables scarred with cigarette burns. A pool table dominated one corner, its green felt looking gray in the poor light. Several club members were scattered around the room, some watching a muted TV mounted on the wall, others engaged in quiet conversation. They barely glanced up as Vince and Lila entered, treating their arrival with practiced indifference. But Lila could feel their awareness, like static electricity in the air. Vince guided her toward a corner where a man sat alone, methodically cleaning his nails with a pocket knife. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. Lila's heart pounded harder as Vince leaned down to speak with him, their voices too low for her to hear over the murmur of conversation and the TV's quiet drone. The anxiety that had been building since she left her father's house seemed to peak, making her hands tremble slightly. She clasped them together, trying to look anywhere but at the two men's serious faces as they continued their hushed discussion. Vince's hand pressed lightly against Lila's back as he guided her down a narrow hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the walls were lined with memories. Photographs yellowed with age showed groups of bikers from decades past, their faces frozen in expressions of defiance and brotherhood. Leather jackets hung like ancient armor, some decorated with patches and pins that told stories Lila couldn't begin to understand. The small room he led her to was sparsely furnished, with just a worn couch pushed against one wall and a simple wooden table. A single lamp cast shadows across the faded wallpaper, making the room feel both cozy and confining. The air smelled of leather and something else, maybe furniture polish or old wood. "Wait here," Vince said gruffly, his voice softer than before. He turned and left, closing the door behind him with a gentle click that somehow seemed more final than a slam would have. Lila's fingers traced the rough fabric of the couch as she sat down, her eyes darting around the room. More photographs covered these walls, women in leather vests standing proudly next to motorcycles, children sitting on bikes while grinning adults looked on, group shots at what appeared to be club gatherings. It was strange seeing these glimpses of normal life in a place that felt anything but normal. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her tense. But when the door opened, it wasn't Vince who entered. Instead, a woman in her late 40s stepped inside, her presence immediately changing the energy in the room. She had laugh lines around her eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair, which was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a simple black t-shirt, no leather vest like the others. "Hello, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice warm and gentle. "I'm Tina." She moved with quiet confidence, pulling up a wooden chair to sit across from Lila. There was something maternal in her presence, a softness that seemed out of place in the compound, but somehow perfectly natural coming from her. Lila watched as Tina reached for a coffee pot on a small side table she hadn't noticed before. The familiar smell of fresh coffee filled the room as Tina poured 2 cups, the steam rising in delicate swirls between them. "I know this must all feel overwhelming," Tina said, adding cream to one of the cups before offering it to Lila. Her movements were unhurried, almost peaceful. "I remember my first night here. Scared me half to death." She smiled, the expression reaching her eyes and making them crinkle at the corners. Lila's hands shook slightly as she accepted the coffee cup, its warmth seeping into her cold fingers. She noticed that Tina had moved her chair closer, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to feel threatening. "I used to be part of all this," Tina continued, gesturing vaguely at the photographs on the walls. Things aren't always what they seem here. These people... She paused, taking a sip of her own coffee. They have their own code, their own way of doing things. Lila stared into her coffee cup, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded her of clouds. The terror that had been gripping her heart since leaving her father's house was still there. But something about Tina's presence made it feel less overwhelming. Tina reached out and patted Lila's knee gently. "It's not as bad as you think," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. The simple touch and kind words made Lila's eyes fill with tears, but she blinked them back, looking up at Tina cautiously. Despite her fear, she felt grateful for this unexpected moment of comfort in the midst of chaos. The small cot creaked as Lila shifted her weight, trying to find a comfortable position. A thin blanket covered her legs, but it did little to ward off the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Outside, raucous laughter and the rumble of motorcycle engines filtered through the window, a constant reminder of where she was. Her eyes traced the patterns of water stains on the ceiling, watching as shadows from passing headlights danced across them. The room was sparse, just the cot, a small dresser with a cracked mirror, and a rickety chair in the corner. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak yellow light that made everything look tired and worn. "How did it come to this?" Lila whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the noise outside. Just yesterday morning, she had been having coffee in her father's kitchen, worrying about normal things like work schedules and grocery lists. Now here she was, lying in a strange bed in a Hell's Angels compound, traded away like a piece of property to settle her father's debt. The memory of her father's face, the shame and desperation in his eyes as he agreed to Vince's terms, made her throat tight with emotion. She could still feel the weight of that moment, the terrible silence that had fallen over their living room when the decision was made. Part of her wanted to hate him for what he'd done, but she couldn't. The pain in his expression told her everything she needed to know about how much this choice had cost him. Rolling onto her side, Lila pulled the blanket up to her chin. The voices outside had grown louder, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the sharp crack of a beer can opening. Someone was playing music now, old rock and roll that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She wondered what her father was doing right now, if he was sitting alone in his kitchen, staring at her empty chair. Tina's earlier kindness had been unexpected, a small light in the darkness of this situation. The older woman's gentle words and understanding smile had given Lila something to hold on to, even if just for a moment. But now, alone in this unfamiliar room, fear crept back in like a shadow. The night grew deeper, and gradually the sounds from outside began to fade. One by one, motorcycles roared to life and departed, their engines growing distant until they disappeared entirely. The music stopped, the laughter died away, and Lila was left with only the sound of her own breathing and the occasional creak of the old building settling. She closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. Every sound made her tense, footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, voices murmuring in distant rooms. The feeling of dread sat heavy in her stomach, making sleep seem impossible. Just as she was finally beginning to drift off, the sound of heavy boots in the hallway made her eyes snap open. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, and she knew immediately who they belonged to. They stopped outside her door, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then Vince's voice, surprisingly soft, came through the door. "I'll keep you safe," he said quietly. Before Lila could process his words, she heard the door close and his footsteps moving away down the hall. leaving her alone with her thoughts in the darkness. The morning sun filtered through the dusty window of Tina's small office, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Lila sat in a worn leather chair, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, while Tina sorted through some papers on her cluttered desk. "You know," Tina said, looking up with kind eyes, "I was scared too when I first came here. Everyone is." She pushed aside a stack of folders and leaned forward. "But there's a rhythm to this place, once you learn it." Over the next few days, Tina became Lila's anchor in this strange new world. They'd spend hours together, sometimes just talking, other times working on paperwork for Tina's nonprofit. Through their conversations, Lila began to understand the complex web of relationships that made up the club. "It's not all violence and chaos," Tina explained one afternoon as they sorted through donation boxes. "There's loyalty here, and family, twisted as it might seem from the outside." Her eyes grew distant. "I lost my own family young, but the club gave me somewhere to belong." Vince would appear periodically, his massive frame filling doorways as he checked on Lila. His visits were brief, his words few, but there was something in the way he looked at her, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her from across the compound, his expression unreadable. "He's not what you'd expect," Tina said one day, noticing Lila's gaze following Vince as he walked away. "None of them are, really. Everyone's got their story." On the fifth evening, Vince appeared at Lila's door. "Get your jacket," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We're going for a ride." The motorcycle rumbled beneath them as they left the compound behind, the wind whipping at Lila's hair. She held on to Vince's leather jacket, watching as the city gave way to rolling countryside. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and despite everything, she felt something close to peace. They stopped at an overlook, the valley spreading out below them like a patchwork quilt. Vince killed the engine, and for a while, they just sat in silence, watching the colors fade from the sky. "I was 12 when my old man left," Vince said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear in the evening stillness. "Mom worked 3 jobs trying to keep us fed. I started running with a rough crowd, thinking I was tough." He gave a bitter laugh. "Ended up in juvie at 14. Lila stayed silent, afraid any word might break this unexpected moment of openness. "The club found me when I was 18, he continued, looking out over the valley. "I was angry, lost. They gave me direction, purpose." His massive shoulders seemed to slump slightly. "Not saying it was right, but it was something." The confession hung in the air between them, unexpected and raw. Lila found herself seeing Vince differently, not just as the intimidating enforcer who'd taken her from her home, but as someone who'd once been lost and searching, just like her. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, and a cool breeze rustled through the grass. Vince started the motorcycle again, the engine's roar breaking the spell of the moment. As they rode back toward the compound, Lila held on tight, feeling the strange freedom of the open road and carrying with her the weight of Vince's unexpected vulnerability. The clubhouse hummed with tension like a live wire. Lila stood near the bar, watching as Snake, a lean member with serpentine tattoos crawling up his neck, squared off against Vince. The air felt thick with cigarette smoke and anger. "You're going soft, Vince," Snake spat, his fingers drumming against the wooden counter. "First you let Miller off easy, now you're treating his kid like she's some kind of guest?" His voice dripped with contempt as he gestured toward Lila. Lila's heart hammered in her chest. She glanced at Tina, who stood a few feet away, her face tight with concern. When their eyes met, Tina gave a small shake of her head, a warning to stay quiet. Stay still. "Watch yourself," Vince said, his voice low and dangerous. He towered over Snake, but the smaller man didn't back down. "Or what?" Snake's lip curled into a sneer. "You used to be our enforcer, man. Now look at you, playing babysitter to some debt collector's daughter." He took a step closer to Vince, jabbing a finger at his chest. The old Vince would have broken Miller's legs, taken everything he owned. The room grew silent. Other club members shifted uncomfortably, some backing away, others leaning in to watch. Lila could feel the electricity in the air, the tension building like a storm about to break. Snake's voice rose higher, more challenging. "Maybe it's time for new leadership, someone who remembers what this club stands for." Vince remained perfectly still, his expression unchanging. But Lila saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but something deeper, more controlled. "You done?" Vince asked quietly. Snake blinked, thrown off by the calm response. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Vince cut him off. "This club," Vince said, his voice carrying across the now silent room, "stands for loyalty, family, brotherhood." He took a step forward, and despite his calm tone, his presence seemed to fill the entire space. "Not mindless violence, not cruelty for cruelty's sake." Snake's confidence wavered visibly. The finger he'd been pointing at Vince's chest slowly lowered. "Miller's debt is being paid," Vince continued, his eyes locked on Snake. "How it's being paid is my decision, as your enforcer, as your brother." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If you have a problem with that, we can discuss it privately, like family." The last words carried a weight that made even Lila shiver. She watched as Snake's defiant stance crumbled under Vince's steady gaze. "No," Snake muttered, backing down. "No problem." He looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support, but found none. The other members stood with Vince, their silence speaking volumes. "Good," Vince said simply. He turned to the bartender. "Next round's on Snake." A few chuckles broke the tension. The crowd began to disperse, conversation slowly returning to normal. Snake slunk away to a corner table, thoroughly deflated. Lila stood rooted to her spot, her mind processing what she'd just witnessed. She'd expected violence, expected the old Vince that Snake had described. Instead, she'd seen something entirely different: leadership, wisdom, and a kind of strength that had nothing to do with breaking legs. She caught Vince's eye across the room. For a moment, they just looked at each other, and Lila felt something shift in her understanding of him. He gave her a slight nod before turning away to speak with some other members. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the clubhouse as Lila sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee. She watched Vince across the room, talking quietly with some of the other members. After the incident with Snake, something had changed in how she saw him. "Mind if I join you?" Vince's deep voice startled her from her thoughts. She looked up to find him standing by her table, 2 fresh cups of coffee in hand. "Sure," Lila said, surprised by how natural it felt now. He set 1 cup in front of her, replacing her empty one. "You handled Snake well yesterday," she said softly, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Vince's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Violence isn't always the answer. Took me a long time to learn that." He paused, his eyes distant. "When I first joined the club, I was angry, ready to fight anyone who looked at me wrong." Lila leaned forward slightly, drawn in by this glimpse into his past. "What changed?" "Life has a way of teaching you hard lessons," he said, running a finger along the rim of his cup. "Started seeing how violence only leads to more violence, how it destroys not just the person you're fighting, but everything around you, too. They spent the next few days like this, sharing quiet moments between the chaos of club life. Vince told her about his first motorcycle, a beat-up Harley he'd restored himself. He spoke about the early days in the club, how it had given him a family when he had none. One evening, they sat on the clubhouse's back porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Most of the other members were out on a run, leaving the compound unusually quiet. "I had a brother once," Vince said suddenly, his voice rough. "Not by blood, but closer than that. Tommy." He stared out at the horizon, his shoulders tense. "He was the one who brought me into the club, showed me the ropes." Lila sat quietly, sensing the weight of what was coming. "We were young, stupid." Vince's hands clenched on the armrests of his chair. "Got into a territory dispute with another club. I wanted to go in guns blazing, but Tommy..." His voice caught. "Tommy tried to negotiate peace, said we could work it out without bloodshed." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of crickets. "They shot him in the back," Vince whispered. "Right in front of me. Didn't even give him a chance to finish talking." His voice cracked, and for the first time, Lila saw tears in his eyes. "He died in my arms, still believing people could be better than they are." Without thinking, Lila reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough beneath her fingers. For a moment, she thought he might pull away, but instead, his hand turned over, gripping hers tightly. "That's why you tried talking to Snake first," she said softly. "Why you gave my father a chance to make things right." Vince nodded, still staring at the horizon. Tommy would have done the same. He looked down at their joined hands, a mixture of surprise and gratitude in his expression. "Sometimes I think he was the best of us, the best of me." They sat there in the growing darkness, hands still linked as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. In that moment, Lila saw past the tattoos and the tough exterior to the man beneath, a man who carried his pain like armor, but still fought to be better than his past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clubhouse windows as Lila wiped down tables in the main room. Most members were out, leaving the place unusually quiet. She could hear voices drifting from Vince's office, his deep rumble, and another man's sharp tone cutting through the silence. "The deal's getting complicated, Vince," the other voice said. "They're asking for more than we agreed on." Lila's hand stilled on the table. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but something in the man's tone made her pause. "I don't care what they're asking for," Vince growled. "We need to make this happen. Miller's debt needs to be settled." Lila's heart skipped. They were talking about her father. "It's not that simple," the other man argued. "They're demanding double now, and if we can't deliver..." He left the threat hanging. "Then we'll find another way," Vince snapped. "I gave my word." "Your word?" The man laughed harshly. "Since when do you care so much about some outsider's debt? This isn't like you, Vince. The girl's got you soft." "Watch it." Vince's voice dropped dangerously low. "This isn't about her. It's about doing what's right." "Right?" the man scoffed. "Nothing about this is right. You're talking about moving dirty money through clean businesses. If this goes wrong..." "It won't," Vince cut him off. "Just get it done." Lila's hands trembled as she gripped the cleaning rag. Dirty money. Clean businesses. Her mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. She'd known the club wasn't exactly legal, but hearing it discussed so openly made her stomach churn. The office door opened suddenly, and Lila quickly pretended to be absorbed in cleaning. The other member, a lean man with graying temples, stormed past her without a glance. She waited until his footsteps faded before straightening up. Taking a deep breath, she marched to Vince's office. He sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples, looking tired and frustrated. When she knocked on the doorframe, his head snapped up. "We need to talk," Lila said, closing the door behind her. Vince's expression hardened. "About what?" "About whatever deal you're making to clear my father's debt." She crossed her arms, meeting his gaze steadily. "I heard you talking. What are you getting involved in?" "That's club business," he said gruffly. "Nothing for you to worry about." "It becomes my business when it involves my father," Lila countered, "and when it involves you putting yourself at risk for us." Vince stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow across the desk. "You don't understand what's going on here." "Then help me understand," Lila pressed, "because from what I heard, you're about to do something dangerous and illegal to help us. Why?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Vince sighed, seeming to deflate slightly. "Your father's debt," he started, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just about money. He borrowed from people who don't play by normal rules. People even the club has to be careful around." "And you're trying to protect us from them?" Lila asked softly. Vince nodded slowly. "I thought I could handle it internally, make some deals, move some money around, but they're making it difficult. They want more than what was originally agreed upon." "Why are you doing this?" Lila's voice wavered slightly. "You could just wash your hands of us, let them deal with my father directly." "Because," Vince said, meeting her eyes, "sometimes doing the right thing means getting your hands dirty to keep others clean." Vince leaned back against his desk, his large frame seeming smaller somehow as he explained the situation. "I've made arrangements," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Your father's debt will be cleared." Lila's heart leaped, but she caught herself. There was something in Vince's expression that made her pause. "What's the catch?" "It's complicated," he said, running a hand through his beard. "These things take time. Moving money around, making deals, it has to be done carefully. Could take weeks, maybe months." Lila's stomach dropped. "Months?" "You'll need to stay here until it's done," Vince continued. "It's the only way I can guarantee your safety, and your father's." Lila sank into a nearby chair, her mind spinning. Months seemed like forever, but at least there was an end in sight. It was more than she'd had yesterday. "The club members," she started hesitantly. "They're okay with this?" "They trust my judgment," Vince replied. His eyes met hers. "And you've earned some respect around here. They've noticed how you handle yourself." Lila thought about the past few weeks, helping in the kitchen, cleaning the clubhouse, learning the rhythms of this strange new world. She'd stopped flinching when the motorcycles roared into the compound. She knew most of the members' names now, recognized their laughs. "What about my job? My apartment?" "Tina's already handling that," Vince said. "She's good at making arrangements, keeping things quiet." As if summoned by her name, Tina appeared in the doorway. Her warm presence filled the room, bringing a sense of calm with it. "I heard you two talking," she said, moving to stand beside Lila. "Thought you might need a friendly face." Lila felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what to think anymore." Tina's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. "Think about this. You're not alone. We've got your back." "But why?" Lila looked between them. "Why go through all this trouble?" Vince shifted uncomfortably, but Tina answered for him. "Because sometimes family isn't just blood. Sometimes it's the people who step up when you need them most." "We're not—" Lila started to protest, but stopped. Weren't they, in a way? These people who'd taken her in, protected her, Taught her to survive in their world? Listen, Tina said, pulling up another chair. I know this isn't the life you chose, but while you're here, you've got people watching out for you. That's more than most people have. Lila nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the situation settling differently on her shoulders. Not lighter, exactly, but more balanced. Besides, Tina continued with a small smile, you're getting pretty good at handling these roughnecks. I saw how you shut down Mickey's nonsense in the kitchen yesterday. A laugh bubbled up unexpectedly in Lila's throat. She had indeed put the burly biker in his place when he'd complained about her cooking. You've got spirit, girl, Tina said proudly, and that's what matters here. These people respect strength, not just the physical kind. Looking around the office, at Vince's steady presence and Tina's encouraging smile, Lila felt something shift inside her. This wasn't the end of her nightmare, but maybe it was the beginning of something else. Something unexpected. For the first time since she'd arrived at the compound, she felt like she could breathe. The future was still uncertain, but at least now she could see a path forward. And she wasn't walking it alone. The soft moonlight filtered through Lila's window as she tossed and turned on her small cot. Sleep had become easier over the past few days, but something still kept her on edge. The compound's familiar nighttime sounds, distant motorcycles, muffled laughter, and classic rock music had become almost like a lullaby. She'd fallen into a routine. Mornings meant helping Tina in the kitchen. Afternoons were spent cleaning or doing odd jobs around the clubhouse. Some of the members even smiled at her now, offering small nods of acknowledgement as she passed. It wasn't home, but it was becoming familiar. A loud crash shattered the quiet night, jolting Lila awake. Her heart hammered in her chest as she sat up, throwing off her blanket. More sounds followed, angry shouts and the distinct thud of fists meeting flesh. Lila scrambled to the window, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. In the courtyard below, chaos erupted under the harsh glow of security lights. A group of men were fighting, their shadows dancing grotesquely across the pavement. She recognized some of the club members, but others were strangers. One man went down hard, his head hitting the ground with a sickening sound. Another swung a chain, the metal glinting in the artificial light. The violence was raw, unrestrained, nothing like the careful control she'd seen from Vince and the others until now. "Get him!" someone shouted. The voice was unfamiliar, filled with rage. Blood spattered across the concrete as someone took a hit to the face. Lila's hands trembled as she gripped the windowsill. These weren't the calculated movements she'd seen during minor disputes at the compound. This was pure savagery. A motorcycle revved somewhere in the darkness, its engine screaming like an angry beast. More shouts echoed across the courtyard, and Lila saw several club members running toward the fight, some carrying weapons. She watched, frozen, as one of the strangers pulled something from his jacket, the metallic glint unmistakable even in the poor light. A gun. "No," she whispered, pressing closer to the glass. The door behind her burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Lila spun around, her heart in her throat. Vince stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway. His face was hard, eyes blazing with an intensity she'd never seen before. In 3 long strides, he crossed the room and grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the window. "Stay out of this, Lila," he warned, his voice rough with concern. His grip was firm, but not painful, as he moved her toward the corner of the room. Another crash from outside made her flinch. The sounds of fighting grew louder, more voices, more impacts, more chaos. Through it all, she could hear the motorcycle's engine still roaring, punctuated by shouts and what might have been gunshots. Lila looked up at Vince, really seeing him for the first time tonight. His knuckles were scraped raw, a fresh cut above his eye dripping blood down his cheek. This wasn't the controlled, authoritative man she'd come to know. This was someone else. Someone dangerous. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Despite the routine she'd fallen into, despite Tina's kindness and Vince's protection, this was still a world of violence and danger. She'd been fooling herself, pretending she could somehow separate the daily life of the compound from its darker reality. The chaos outside intensified. Glass shattered somewhere nearby, followed by angry screams and the sound of running feet. Lila's whole body trembled as the truth sank in. She wasn't just visiting this dangerous world anymore. She was living in it. The fight had died down, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by distant sirens. Lila sat on her cot, watching as Vince dabbed at the cut above his eye with a damp cloth. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly. The first rays of dawn were starting to peek through the window, casting long shadows across the room. "You should let me help with that," Lila said softly, reaching for the cloth. Vince hesitated, then handed it to her. She stood up, careful not to make any sudden movements, and gently pressed the cloth against his wound. He winced but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have to see any of this." Lila paused, surprised by the emotion in his voice. The tough exterior he always maintained was cracking, revealing something raw underneath. "This life," he continued, staring at his scraped knuckles. "It's not what I wanted it to be. When I joined the club, I was young, angry, thought I found a family." He let out a bitter laugh. "Instead, I found more violence, more pain." The silence stretched between them as Lila cleaned his wound. His shoulders slumped, making him look smaller somehow, less intimidating than the man who'd first appeared at her father's door. "I've done things I'm not proud of," Vince said, his voice thick with regret. "Hurt people, threatened them, collected debts like I did with your father." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain. "And now I've dragged you into this mess. You don't deserve any of it." Lila's hand stilled against his forehead. She'd never seen him like this. Vulnerable, honest, human. "Every night," he continued, "I lie awake thinking about how I could have done things differently. Maybe if I'd made better choices." His voice trailed off. "But now I'm in too deep. And worse, I've pulled you down with me." He stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. "You should be out there, living, your life, not stuck in this hellhole because of your father's debt, because of me." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Lila watched him, seeing past the tattoos and scars to the man beneath. Someone trapped by his own choices, just as she was trapped by her father's. "I don't blame you," Lila said quietly, surprising herself with the truth in those words. "We're both caught in circumstances we didn't choose." Vince stopped pacing, turning to look at her with disbelief. "My father made his choices," she continued. "You made yours, and I made mine when I agreed to come here." She stood up, meeting his gaze. "Maybe we're both trapped, but that doesn't mean we have to stay that way." Something shifted in Vince's expression, a glimmer of hope breaking through the guilt and regret. He nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "Together," Lila said, "maybe we can find a way out of this. Both of us." The morning sun had fully risen now, filling the room with golden light. In that moment, they were just two people sharing the weight of their circumstances, finding unexpected understanding in each other's company. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound when Lila heard the commotion at the front gate. She was helping Tina sort through old motorcycle parts when voices caught her attention. Through the chain-link fence, she spotted a familiar figure that made her heart stop. "Dad?" she whispered, squinting against the sunlight. Daniel Miller stood at the entrance, looking nothing like the proud man she remembered. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his face had grown gaunt and pale. Even from a distance, she could see how his hands trembled as he spoke to the guards. Vince appeared from nowhere, exchanging words with the guards before nodding. The gate creaked open, and Daniel shuffled inside, his steps unsteady. Lila dropped the parts she was holding and ran toward him. "Dad!" She reached out to hug him, but stopped short when she saw how fragile he looked up close. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his cheeks had hollowed out. Her father had aged years in just a few weeks. "Lila," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My little girl." She guided him to a nearby bench, supporting his weight as he lowered himself down. His breathing came in short, labored gasps. "What happened to you?" Lila asked, her voice thick with concern. She took his hand, alarmed at how cold and clammy it felt. Daniel tried to speak but coughed instead, a dry, rattling sound that shook his entire body. Lila rubbed his back, feeling every vertebra through his thin shirt. When the coughing subsided, he looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "I haven't been sleeping," he managed. "Can't eat. The thought of what I've done—" His voice cracked. "What I did to you." "Dad, please," Lila said, squeezing his hand. "Don't make yourself sick over this." He shook his head, tears gathering in his eyes. "I'm your father. I was supposed to protect you. Instead, Another coughing fit interrupted him. Lila noticed Vince watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. She turned back to her father, who had finally caught his breath. "I love you so much, Lila," Daniel said, his voice weak but urgent. "You're all I have left in this world, and I traded you away like some kind of—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm so sorry," he continued, tears now falling freely. "I'm sorry for everything. The debt, the business failing, not being strong enough to find another way." Lila felt her own eyes welling up. She wrapped her arms around her father's thin shoulders, careful not to squeeze too hard. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered. "We'll figure this out. I'll find a way to fix things." Even as she said the words, she had no idea how she would make good on that promise. The debt still loomed over them, and she was still bound to the club. But seeing her father so broken, so consumed by guilt, she knew she had to try. Daniel leaned into her embrace, his body trembling. "My brave girl," he murmured, "always trying to make things right." They sat there on the bench, father and daughter, both caught in circumstances neither of them could control, both trying to find a way forward through the darkness. Lila couldn't sleep that night. Her father's visit had shaken her to her core. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his gaunt face, heard his rattling cough. She tossed and turned on her small cot, the springs creaking beneath her. Around 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep entirely. Sitting up, she pulled her knees to her chest and stared out the small window. The compound was quiet except for the occasional sound of motorcycles in the distance. "I can't keep waiting," she whispered to herself. Her father was wasting away with guilt, and she was stuck here, watching helplessly. The thought made her chest tight with anxiety. She got up and paced the small room, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Her mind raced through possibilities. The club dealt in money. Lots of it. There had to be a way to settle the debt, something she could do to fix this mess. Lila grabbed a notepad from her bedside table and started writing. Her hand trembled slightly as she jotted down ideas, crossing out the impossible ones, circling the maybes. She thought about what she'd learned during her time here, the way the club operated, their businesses, their connections. The sun was rising when she finally had something resembling a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it was definitely dangerous, but it was better than doing nothing. She needed to talk to Vince. She found him in the garage later that morning, working on his motorcycle. His large hands were covered in grease as he adjusted something on the engine. He looked up when she approached, his expression softening slightly. "We need to talk," Lila said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Vince wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward a quiet corner of the garage. They sat on 2 worn stools, away from the other club members. "I have an idea," she began, pulling out her notepad. "About the debt." Vince's eyebrows rose slightly as she explained her plan. She'd noticed how the club handled their legitimate businesses, the garage, the bar, even some real estate. With her business background, she could help them streamline operations, make them more profitable. In exchange, she wanted a portion of the increased profits to go toward her father's debt. "I can work," she said, her words coming faster now. "I'm good with numbers, with organization. I can help make things better here, legal things, and maybe—" She took a deep breath. "Maybe we can find a way to clean up some of the other operations, too." Vince listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You understand what you're asking?" he finally said, his voice low and serious. "Getting involved in club business, even the legal side, it's not simple. There are people who won't like it, people who might see it as a threat." Lila nodded. "I know there are risks, but I can't just sit here anymore. My father—" Her voice caught. "He's dying from the guilt. I have to do something." Vince ran a hand through his beard, considering. "It could work," he admitted. "But it's dangerous, Lila. One wrong move." "Will you help me?" she asked, meeting his eyes. Vince held her gaze for a long moment. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll help you. But we do this carefully, understand? One step at a time." Relief flooded through Lila. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way forward. She clutched her notepad tighter, ready to take the first step toward freedom. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Vince's office as Lila spread out several maps on his desk. They'd been meeting like this for days now, always early before the other club members were awake. Vince stood behind her, his large frame casting a shadow over the papers. "The main road here," Lila pointed to a winding path on the map. "It's usually empty after midnight. We could take that route first, then switch to these back roads." Vince nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good thinking. Less chance of being spotted?" He traced a thick finger along the route she'd marked. "We'll need supplies, though. Can't stop anywhere for at least the first 100 miles." Lila pulled out a small notebook from her back pocket. She'd been carefully documenting everything they'd need: water, food, extra gas, basic medical supplies. The list was growing longer every day. "I can get most of these things without raising suspicion," she said. "Tina's been letting me help with the supply runs. No one questions it anymore." "Be careful," Vince warned. "Don't get too many things at once, and make sure to hide them well." He moved to the window, scanning the compound. A few early, risers were already milling about the garage. Lila watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "Coming with me? You're leaving everything behind." Vince turned back to her, his eyes serious. "This life." He gestured vaguely at the compound. "It's not what it used to be. Things are changing, getting darker. Maybe it's time for something new." They spent the next hour going over details. Vince knew which cameras to avoid, which guards would be easiest to slip past. Lila memorized the escape route, calculating distances and timing. They couldn't write anything down. It was too risky. Later that day, Lila made her first supply run. She bought basic items, bottled water, protein bars, first aid supplies, mixing them in with the regular club shopping. Back at the compound, she carefully stored them in various hiding spots they'd identified. The days passed slowly. Each morning, Lila would wake up wondering if today would be the day someone discovered their plan. But life in the compound continued as usual. She kept to her routine, trying not to draw attention to herself. Vince was equally careful. He maintained his gruff exterior, barking orders and keeping discipline. But Lila noticed how he was quietly preparing, storing extra cash, gathering important documents, making subtle arrangements that wouldn't raise eyebrows. Finally, after weeks of preparation, they set a date. 3 days away, during a night when most of the club would be at a rally 2 towns over. It seemed perfect, their best chance at a clean getaway. The night before their planned escape, Lila was in her room, double-checking their supplies one last time. Her heart was racing with anticipation and fear. Tomorrow, everything would change. A soft knock at her window made her jump. Her hands trembled as she pulled back the curtain. There was no one there, but a small piece of paper had been pushed under the frame. With shaking fingers, Lila unfolded the note. The message was brief, written in unfamiliar handwriting. FBI investigation incoming. Club under surveillance. Get out now. The paper slipped from her numb fingers. Lila's mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. The careful plan she and Vince had crafted suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable. They weren't just running from the club anymore. They were running from the law, too. The night air exploded with the sharp crack of gunfire. Lila jerked awake, the warning note still clutched in her trembling hands. Outside her window, chaos erupted as motorcycles roared into the compound, their riders firing weapons into the darkness. "Get down!" Tina burst through the door, her face pale with fear. She grabbed Lila's arm and pulled her to the floor just as bullets shattered the window, sending glass spraying across the room. "Stay low and follow me." Lila's heart hammered in her chest as she crawled behind Tina. The sounds of fighting grew louder, angry shouts, more gunfire, the crash of breaking glass. Through the broken window, she glimpsed dark figures moving through the compound, their faces hidden behind masks. "It's the River Street crew," Tina whispered, pressing herself against the wall. "They've been wanting our territory for months." Another explosion rocked the building. Smoke began seeping under the door. Somewhere in the distance, Lila heard someone screaming for help. She thought of Vince, wondering if he was alive, if he was fighting back against the attackers. "We need to get to the back exit," Tina said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "There's a tunnel that leads—" The door burst open. 2 masked men stormed in, guns raised. Tina shoved Lila behind a fallen bookshelf and lunged at the closest attacker. In the struggle, a gun went off. Tina crumpled to the floor. "No!" Lila screamed. The second man turned toward her, but before he could raise his weapon, someone tackled him from behind. Through her tears, Lila recognized Vince's massive frame as he slammed the attacker into the wall. The fight was brutal but quick. Vince's experience showed in every movement as he disarmed the man and knocked him unconscious. The other attacker fled, leaving his companion behind. "Tina!" Lila crawled to where her friend lay. Blood spread across Tina's shirt, but she was still breathing. "We have to help her." "The medical crew is on their way," Vince said, his voice rough. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and his knuckles were raw. "But we need to move. Now." More explosions rocked the compound. Through the broken window, Lila saw flames licking up the side of the main building. Club members and attackers clashed in the courtyard, the night filled with the sound of their battle. "I can't leave her," Lila protested, holding Tina's hand. "Go," Tina whispered, squeezing Lila's fingers. "I'll be okay. Just go." Vince grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her to her feet. "This is our chance," he said urgently. "The rival gang, the FBI warning, it's all falling apart. We have to leave now." Tears streamed down Lila's face as she let go of Tina's hand. Vince led her through the smoky hallway, keeping her close as they navigated through the chaos. They dodged fighters, ducked under gunfire, and ran past burning vehicles. The compound had become a war zone. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, some moving, others terrifyingly still. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic smell of blood. Lila's lungs burned as she ran, following Vince's lead. "Almost there," Vince shouted over the noise. They were approaching the compound's back gate. A few motorcycles stood abandoned nearby, their owners caught up in the fighting. A bullet whizzed past Lila's head. She screamed as Vince yanked her behind a concrete barrier. More shots followed, pinging off the metal and concrete around them. Vince reached out, gripped her arm firmly. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back. Just run." His eyes met, hers, filled with determination, and something else. Fear, not for himself, but for her. Lila winced as Vince dabbed antiseptic on the cut along her forearm. They sat in the dim light of an abandoned warehouse, their temporary sanctuary filled with old crates and dusty machinery. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in pale grays and pinks. "It's not deep," Vince muttered, wrapping a bandage around her arm. His own injuries were worse. A nasty gash above his eye and bruised ribs that made him grimace with every movement. "You'll be okay." Lila watched his hands work, steady despite everything they'd been through. The events at the compound played over and over in her mind. The gunfire, the explosions, Tina lying wounded on the floor. Her chest tightened with worry. "Do you think Tina made it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vince finished securing the bandage before answering. "Tina's tough. She's survived worse." But there was uncertainty in his eyes that made Lila's stomach churn. The warehouse creaked around them, its metal walls expanding in the morning heat. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced through holes in the roof. Their motorcycle stood near the entrance, partially hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets. "We need to figure out our next move," Vince said, packing away the first aid supplies in his saddlebag. "The compound isn't safe anymore. The River Street crew will be back, and now with the FBI sniffing around..." He shook his head. Lila stood up, ignoring the ache in her muscles. "I need to see my dad," she said firmly. "After everything that's happened, I have to know he's okay." "It's too dangerous. The River Street crew might be watching his place, waiting for us to show up." Vince's voice was gruff with concern. "I don't care," Lila insisted. "He was sick the last time I saw him. What if something's happened? What if he needs help?" Her voice cracked with emotion. Vince ran a hand through his beard, considering. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional coo of pigeons in the rafters. "Please," Lila said softly. "I need to do this." After a long moment, Vince nodded. "All right," he said, pushing himself to his feet with a grunt of pain. "But I'm coming with you. We'll take the back roads, stay off the main streets." Relief flooded through Lila. She helped Vince gather their few belongings, stuffing them into the motorcycle's saddlebags. The morning sun was climbing higher, promising another hot day. "We'll need to be careful," Vince said as he straddled the motorcycle. "Quick in and out, no lingering." He looked at her seriously. "First sign of trouble, we leave. Deal?" Lila nodded, climbing on behind him. "Deal." The motorcycle roared to life, echoing through the empty warehouse. As they pulled out onto the quiet street, Lila wrapped her arms around Vince's waist, grateful for his solid presence. Her thoughts turned to her father, his tired face, his illness, his guilt. She prayed he would be okay. They wound their way through the city's back streets, avoiding the main roads where they might be spotted. Every intersection made Lila's heart jump, expecting to see rival gang members or police cars. But the streets remained relatively empty in the early morning hours. As they approached her father's neighborhood, Lila's anxiety grew. The familiar houses looked different somehow, more threatening. She found herself scanning every shadow, every parked car, looking for signs of danger. Vince slowed the motorcycle as they neared Daniel's house, killing the engine a block away to avoid drawing attention. He turned to look at Lila, his face serious. "Ready?" The early morning sun cast long shadows across Daniel's front yard as Lila and Vince approached the house. Empty newspapers littered the unmowed lawn, and the usually well-maintained flower beds had withered from neglect. Lila's heart sank at the sight. "Something's wrong," she whispered, quickening her pace. The front door was unlocked, unusual for her security-conscious father. Inside, the house was dark and eerily quiet. The air felt stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed dishes and forgotten meals. Lila's fingers fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the cluttered living room. Bills and unopened mail covered every surface. "Dad?" Lila called out, her voice trembling. "Dad, are you here?" A weak cough answered from the bedroom. Lila rushed down the hallway, Vince following close behind. She found Daniel lying in bed, pale and thin, surrounded by used tissues and half-empty water glasses. His eyes, sunken and tired, widened at the sight of her. "Lila?" he croaked, trying to sit up. "Is it really you?" "Don't try to move," Lila said, hurrying to his side. She pressed her hand against his forehead. He was burning with fever. "How long have you been like this?" Daniel's eyes darted to Vince, who stood silently in the doorway. "I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, not knowing if you were safe." His voice broke. "The guilt, it's been eating me alive." Lila grabbed a fresh glass of water from the bathroom and helped him drink. Her hands shook as she held the glass to his lips, seeing how much weight he'd lost, how his clothes hung loose on his frame. "This is all my fault," Daniel whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "I did this to you. My own daughter. I let them take you." He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I'm so sorry, Lila. I'm so sorry." "Dad, stop," Lila said firmly. She sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand. "Yes, what you did was wrong. But I'm not a victim anymore. I'm choosing my own path now." Vince shifted in the doorway, drawing Daniel's attention. The sick man's face hardened. "You," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You took her." "He's been protecting me," Lila interrupted. "Things aren't what they seem, Dad. Vince has been helping me find a way out." Daniel looked between them, confusion clear on his face. "I don't understand." "You don't have to understand everything right now," Lila said gently. "What you need to know is that I'm taking control of my life. No more running from debts, no more hiding from problems." She squeezed his hand. "We're going to fix this together, but first we need to get you well again." "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Daniel mumbled, fresh tears rolling down his cheeks. "Maybe not," Lila agreed, her voice steady. "But you're getting it anyway, because that's my choice to make." She stood up, straightening her shoulders. "Now, we're going to clean this place up, get some food in you, and then we're going to figure out our next steps. Together." Daniel looked at his daughter with wonder, seeing not the frightened young woman who'd been taken away, but someone stronger, more confident. Someone who'd found her own power in the midst of chaos. "When did you become so strong?" he asked softly. Lila smiled, though her eyes were serious. "When I stopped letting others decide my fate for me." Vince stood in the corner of Daniel's bedroom, watching Lila tend to her father. His weathered face showed the weight of countless sleepless nights and hard decisions. The morning light filtering through the dusty windows cast shadows across his features, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. He cleared his throat, drawing both Lila and Daniel's attention. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice rough but determined. "I've got savings. Been putting money away for years, never knew what for." He pulled out his phone, checking his banking app. "It's enough to cover what you owe, Miller, every penny." Daniel's face flushed with shame. "No," he said weakly, shaking his head. "I won't take your money." "It's not charity," Vince insisted, taking a step forward. His massive frame seemed to fill the small bedroom. "Think of it as making things right." He glanced at Lila, his expression softening. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. Taking your daughter that night, that's at the top of the list." Lila watched the exchange, her heart pounding. She could see the internal struggle playing across her father's face, pride warring with desperation, shame battling with hope. "I can't," Daniel repeated, his voice breaking. "After everything that's happened, everything I put Lila through, I don't deserve an easy way out." Vince ran a hand through his beard, frustration evident in his movements. "This isn't about what you deserve," he growled. "It's about ending this, breaking the cycle." He pulled up a chair next to the bed, sitting down heavily. "You think I earned this money doing honest work? But maybe this is how I start making things right." Daniel turned his face away, tears streaming down his cheeks. "How can I live with myself? Taking money from the man who—" His voice trailed off. "The man who what?" Vince challenged. "The man who took your daughter? Or the man who protected her? The man who's trying to help you both get out of this mess?" The tension in the room was palpable. Lila looked between the two men, her father, broken but still clinging to his pride, and Vince, the unlikely savior offering redemption. She stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Dad, look at me." When Daniel met her eyes, she continued, "This isn't just about you anymore. This is about all of us finding a way forward." She sat on the edge of the bed, taking his hand. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't fighting. It's accepting help when it's offered." Daniel's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I'm supposed to be the one protecting you," he whispered. "Not the other way around." "Then protect me by accepting this," Lila urged. "Let's end this nightmare. Let's give ourselves a chance to heal." She squeezed his hand. "Please, Dad." The room fell silent except for Daniel's ragged breathing. Finally, he looked up at Vince, his eyes red but clear. "You're sure about this?" Vince nodded solemnly. "Never been more sure of anything in my life." Daniel drew a shaky breath, then nodded slowly, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." 3 weeks after settling the debt, Lila sat on her father's front porch, watching the autumn leaves dance across the yard. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of brewing coffee from inside the house. Her father's health had improved significantly since the weight of the debt had been lifted from his shoulders. The familiar rumble of a motorcycle caught her attention. Vince's imposing figure appeared at the end of the street, his leather jacket gleaming in the morning sun. He pulled up to the house, cutting the engine. Even from a distance, Lila could see the changes in him. His shoulders seemed lighter, his movements less guarded. "Morning," he called out, climbing off his bike. His boots crunched on the fallen leaves as he made his way up the path. "Coffee's fresh," Lila offered, gesturing to the house. Inside, they could hear Daniel moving around in the kitchen. Vince nodded, following her inside. The kitchen was warm and inviting, a far cry from the tense atmosphere that had filled it just weeks ago. Daniel looked up from his newspaper, offering Vince a small but genuine smile. "How are things at the club?" Daniel asked, pouring coffee into 3 mugs. Vince accepted his cup with a grateful nod. "Different," he said after a thoughtful pause. "I'm stepping back, taking more of an advisory role." He glanced at Lila. "Less hands-on stuff, no more collections." Lila felt her heart lift at his words. She'd seen the toll the violent lifestyle had taken on him, the way it had eaten at his conscience. "What will you do instead?" she asked, wrapping her hands around her warm mug. "Got a buddy who runs a custom motorcycle shop," Vince replied. "Legitimate business. He's been asking me to come work for him for years." He took a sip of coffee. "Figure it's time I listened." Daniel folded his newspaper, his expression serious. That's good, Vince. Real good." The 3 of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. "I'm heading out of town for a while," Vince finally said, his voice quiet. "Need some time to figure things out. Make a fresh start." Lila felt her throat tighten. She'd known this was coming, but it still hit her hard. "When do you leave?" "Today," he answered, meeting her eyes. "Got my bags packed and everything?" Daniel stood up, understanding passing between the 2 men. "I'll give you folks a minute," he said, squeezing his daughter's shoulder as he left the kitchen. Alone now, Lila and Vince faced each other. The man who had once terrified her now stood before her as someone entirely different, someone who had shown her strength, protection, and ultimately, redemption. "I never thought I'd say this," Lila began, her voice wavering slightly. "But I'm going to miss you, Vince." He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "You helped me see things differently, Lila. Showed me there was still good in this world, still hope for someone like me." Lila stood up, closing the distance between them. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around his massive frame. After a moment's surprise, he returned the embrace, his usual gruffness giving way to gentleness. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, "and thank you for everything." Vince stepped back, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You too, kid. You too." Morning sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows of the Miller house, casting warm patches across the freshly swept hardwood floors. Lila stood in her father's workshop, running her hand along the smooth surface of an unfinished oak table. The familiar scent of sawdust filled the air, mixing with the aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. "Dad?" she called out, picking up a piece of sandpaper. "Need any help with this one?" Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face fuller and healthier than it had been in months. He was wearing his old work apron, the one that had gathered dust during the darkest days of their troubles. "You remember how to sand with the grain?" Lila smiled, already starting the careful strokes along the wood. "You taught me when I was 12, remember? Some things you don't forget." They worked together in comfortable silence, the rhythmic sound of sandpaper against wood filling the workshop. It was a far cry from the tense, fear-filled atmosphere that had dominated their home just months ago. Now, peace had settled over them like a warm blanket. "I've been thinking," Lila said, pausing to brush sawdust from her sleeve. About starting those art therapy classes at the community center. Daniel looked up from his work, his eyes bright with interest. The ones you talked about before, everything happened? Yeah. Lila moved to the other side of the table, her movements confident and purposeful. Working with troubled teens, using art to help them process their experiences. After everything we've been through. She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. I think I understand now, more than ever, how important it is to have someone believe in you when you're lost. Her father set down his tools, studying her face. The past few months had changed her. Gone was the frightened young woman who'd been traded to settle a debt. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had found her own kind of wisdom in the darkness. The community center called yesterday, she continued. They're still looking for someone to run the program. I have an interview next week. Daniel crossed the workshop, placing his hands on her shoulders. You're going to be amazing at this, sweetheart. Those kids, they'll be lucky to have you. Lila leaned into her father's embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart. His health had improved dramatically since the debt had been settled. The crushing weight of fear and shame had lifted, allowing him to return to his craft with renewed passion. I'm thinking of reopening the furniture store too, Daniel said softly. Starting small this time. No loans, no shortcuts. Just honest work, one piece at a time. One piece at a time, Lila repeated, smiling. It had become their mantra over the past months, a reminder that healing, like crafting fine furniture, couldn't be rushed. They returned to their work, the morning light growing stronger as they smoothed rough edges and filled old cracks. The table beneath their hands was transforming, just as they were, from something broken into something beautiful. Through the workshop window, Lila could see their garden coming back to life. The flower beds her mother had loved so much were blooming again, tended by their careful hands. Like the flowers pushing through the soil, they too were growing stronger, their roots deeper, their foundation more secure than ever before. Daniel watched his daughter work, pride evident in his eyes. The skills he'd taught her years ago flowed naturally in her movements, but there was something new there too, a confidence born from surviving the storm, from finding her own path through the darkness. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the parking lot of Jake's Diner as Lila pulled up in her father's old pickup truck. Her hands were steady on the wheel, no trace of the trembling that had plagued her during those first terrifying motorcycle rides. Through the window, she could see Vince's broad silhouette at a corner booth, his leather vest draped over the back of his seat. Taking a deep breath, Lila stepped out of the truck. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the familiar smell of coffee and pie filled her nostrils. A few regular customers glanced up, then returned to their meals. This was neutral ground, far from the compound and the life she'd left behind. You look good, kid, Vince said as she slid into the booth across from him. His voice was gruff but warm, like worn leather. I feel good, Lila replied, meeting his eyes. The fear that had once made her want to shrink away was gone. In its place was understanding, even gratitude. Dad's doing better too. The workshop is almost ready to reopen. The waitress brought over 2 cups of coffee without being asked. Vince wrapped his tattooed hands around his mug, the ink telling stories of a life Lila had glimpsed but never fully known. I start my new job next week, she continued, adding cream to her coffee. At the community center, art therapy for troubled teens. She paused, stirring her drink. I thought about you when I applied, about how sometimes people just need someone to see past their rough edges. Vince's expression softened slightly. You always did see more than most people. I wanted to thank you, Lila said, her voice steady. I know it sounds crazy, given how everything started, but you helped me find my strength. You showed me I could survive anything." "You always had that strength," Vince replied, his eyes distant. "Sometimes it takes the darkest moments to show us what we're made of." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun streaming through the diner's windows. Lila could see the changes in Vince, too, subtle shifts in the way he carried himself, as if some of his own burdens had lifted. "The club?" she asked quietly. "Still there," he said, "but I'm making changes, taking steps back. Some roads need to end." Lila nodded, understanding what remained unsaid. They finished their coffee, and when the check came, they both reached for it. Vince waved her hand away. "Let me have this one," he said, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They walked out into the parking lot together. The setting sun had turned the sky into a canvas of orange and purple, reminding Lila of all the sunsets she'd watched from the compound, wondering if she'd ever feel free again. "Take care of yourself, Vince," she said, turning to face him one last time. "You too, kid," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You too." Vince smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and softened his weathered features. Lila felt a wave of peace wash over her as she turned away, her steps sure and steady as she walked toward her truck. She could feel Vince watching her go, a silent guardian until the very end. The sun continued its descent, painting the world in gentle golds and shadows as Lila drove away. In her rearview mirror, she could see Vince's figure growing smaller, a part of her past that had, against all odds, helped guide her toward a brighter future. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.